Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. I have lots of questions for Ben and Shane, and I know they want to hear your questions too. So please use the question and answer function in Zoom, as opposed to you can use the chat. You can chat with each other. You can share your location, whatever else you want, as long as it is polite and decorous. But please use the question and answer function for your questions so that we can keep track of those and don't miss them. And then I'm going to ask them throughout the event, please, by all means. But then toward the end of the event, a little bit later in the hour, we're going to get to those questions. So I'm going to start with some of my own questions for the panelist, but we want to hear from you as well. I also expect that we're drawing folks in from different sources. So I'll just introduce myself quickly. My name's Arno Rosenfeld, and I'm the enterprise reporter at The Forward, which is an American Jewish newspaper. And I also write a weekly newsletter on anti-Semitism, which you can find at forward.com/notebook and hopefully sign up for if you're not already. And I know many of you are coming from the newsletter where I promoted this event, so it's fun to be able to see some of you in a new forum. And joining me tonight are the authors of Safety Through Solidarity, A Radical Guide to Fighting Antisemitism. Ben Lober is senior analyst at Political Research Associates, a social movement think tank, where he studies and publishes on anti-Semitism and white nationalism. He previously worked as national campus organizer at Jewish Voice for Peace and has written extensively on anti-Semitism, Israel-Palestine, and Jewish identity. I was looking up to find the first article where I spoke to Ben, and I think it was back in 2021, shortly after I joined The Forward, and that was during a previous outbreak of violence in Israel and Gaza, so some resonant themes. And I've spoken to him with him for many stories since then. And this is actually my first time, other than the prep call, speaking with Shane Burley, who's known for his work on the far right and left-wing social movements. But I've read many of his pieces across different publications, and he's the author of several books, including Fascism Today, What It Is and How to End It, Why We Fight, Essays on Fascism, Resistance, and Surviving the Apocalypse, and editor of the anthology No Parasan, Readings on Anti-Fascism. So just by way of background, before we jump into questions, I want to share, how I came to find out and be interested in this book and why I wanted to do this event. So when I saw that Ben was working on a book about anti-Semitism, I was really excited to read it because in a sea of really vitriolic takes on Israel and anti-Semitism and the intersection thereof, I found him to always be both thoughtful and able to sort of respond to the facts in front of him. And that's a kind of rare trait these days, sadly, when many people are kind of trying to craft the facts to fit their perspective. So I was curious to see what he would have to say in this book. And I was intrigued that Shane, whose work on fascism has touched on a lot of anti-Semitism, was devoting himself to this book-length examination with Ben. And I have to say, it didn't disappoint. The book was a really comprehensive left-wing analysis of anti-Semitism that weaves together history and political theory, a lot of footnotes and references. I found myself circling, different sections to go check the endnotes and find some more reading. And it also includes, actual incidents of anti-Semitism, different anecdotes, practical advice. So I do recommend it to folks who are interested in this topic. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this as an event and really hear from both Shane and Ben is we see a lot of progressive criticism of the mainstream approach to fighting anti-Semitism, especially around Israel, but beyond that as well. But as Shane and Ben write, and I am taking this a little bit out of context, but I think it works. You guys write at one point, critique and judgment do little to change political realities. Mostly it just pushes people to curl up into a ball of terror and fear and shut down. And so I'm sure that folks in the audience won't agree with everything that Ben and Shane wrote in the book or everything that they'll say during this program, but they've made a really earnest attempt, coming from their political perspective, to go beyond just that critique and judgment and propose some solutions for Jews who might not be curled into balls, but find themselves afraid of anti-Semitism, not quite sure the current approach is working, but unsure what to do instead. I hear from a lot of these folks, and hopefully some have made it into the audience tonight. And as a little disclaimer, I also have to say, because I do hear from other folks, that this isn't an endorsement of the author's approach. The Forward doesn't do endorsements. What we do is something that is increasingly, and I think tragically rare in the Jewish community and in Jewish media, which is to provide a platform for audiences like this one to hear a wide breadth of interesting and important ideas, in this case, about anti-Semitism. So with all that preamble, and that sort of critique of critiques, I actually do want to start with your critique of the prevailing approach to fighting anti-Semitism, which you refer to as a vertical alliance. So could you explain, whoever wants to start, what the vertical alliance is, what it refers to, and how it impacts where some of the Jewish establishment leaders focus their attention? So, for example, why we hear a lot more lately about progressives on campuses as opposed to, say, Christian nationalists in Congress.
Mm. Well, thanks so much for that intro, Arno. It's really great to be here. It's an honor. And yeah, yeah, I guess the vertical alliance is a term that has been used a lot in Jewish studies. We aren't the first to coin it, but yeah, it really refers to the broken priorities of much of the American Jewish establishment. Too often the fight against anti-Semitism is siloed from other forms of oppression. It's as you said, the leaders of in some of the largest mainstream communal institutions, like the federations, or the Anti-Defamation League, focus on stamping out anti-Semitism they perceive in the movement for justice in Palestine, while doing relatively little to combat its seismic growth on the right. And we call it a vertical alliance because often this involves an alliance with power, right? An alliance with, say, the bipartisan political establishment to pass laws like the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which is still in Congress right now, that would use the levers of the state to potentially to penalize or to make illegal a broad category of speech that's critical of Israel, or it's the state of Israel, say, making an alliance with the U.S. government and building higher walls and tighter borders. So it's this broad idea that only by allying with state power will Jews stay safe. And I think the alternative that we propose is maybe you could call it a horizontal alliance, only by allying with other groups who are marginalized and oppressed, only by building horizontal relationships of solidarity, and grassroots movements for broad change against anti-Semitism and all forms of repression. That's where I think Jews can find the most reliable pathway for our safety.
Yeah. Yeah, Ben, I think you said it well. I also want to thank Arno. I'm a big reader of the newsletter, so I'm happy to be here and excited to be part of one of these sort of panels at the forward, kind of adding to the Jewish culture of debate. I think as Ben talked about, and a number of people I interviewed when reporting for the book would actually tell me, be like, building a sort of connection with those in power, that is the Jewish way of solving these problems. And a number of people said, well, this is historically what we've done. We've worked with, leaders that were allies of us, on the one hand, and then built up a sort of strong support for the state of Israel as another sort of defensive mechanism. And we talk throughout the book about those sort of two tent poles, sort of political centrism and stasis on the one hand, and kind of a pro-Israel consensus on the other, have not actually proven to decrease anti-Semitism. They haven't have provably defended Jews, kept Jews safe. But what they have done is kind of moved us away from the world of social movements where you can build kind of cross-community alliances to go after common issues. So instead, in the book, we talk about what are the elements that really drive anti-Semitism, not just as a perennial hatred, not as something that's impossible to solve, but what are the material things that actually motivate anti-Semitic ideas, conspiracy theories, and things like that. And then how can we build community movements that kind of can target those shared sources of oppression? And so we want to move a little bit away from what a lot of sort of technocratic organizations have thought of as the solution to dealing with anti-Semitism and bring it back to communities. What can we do to be safer? What can we do to build alliances with our neighbors? How can we use social movements? And how can we push for a world that makes really big change on some of the fundamental underlying issues that lead to anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I just want to highlight like how dangerous this vertical alliance is. I think not only for Jewish safety, but for the safety of all groups. Like on the national and global stage, you have our communal leaders allying with Christian nationalists white nationalists like Donald Trump and his MAGA movement, who have an agenda that's really inimical to Jewish safety and thriving. You have, you have the head of the Anti-Defamation League, handing Jared Kushner an award at their Never Is Now summit that happened recently and saying, I don't care how you vote, we have to praise one of the people in the horrific Trump administration. Or you have, just to give an example, just from yesterday, in the UC school system, over at the University of California, their latest strategy to fight anti-Semitism is to ban masks, right? On the grounds that, like, by banning masks, they can crack down on Palestine protests on campus. This also bans masks that people wear, as public health and safety measures in the ongoing COVID pandemic, right? So the strategy of allying with power is really disastrous for Jewish safety and for the safety of all marginalized groups.
And this is perhaps a little bit related. Is one way that we hear a lot of mainstream Jewish leaders talk about anti-Semitism is sort of in terms of extremes. So the idea is if you go far enough to the right or far enough to the left, you will find anti-Semitism, and that there's a center that is safe for the Jews, and that is a center that is often where you find, for example, members of Congress who will pass bipartisan legislation about anti-Semitism. It's where you find collaboration with, high levels of, federal law enforcement, for example. And sometimes this idea of the extreme right and left is presented as sort of a horseshoe. So the idea is that the far left and the far right meet at a point in sort of a cesspool of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theory, and that they're basically the same once you get to that anti-Semitic extreme. And in your book, you talk about anti-Semitism across the political spectrum, and we're going to get to some of that later in what you write about anti-Semitism on the left. But you make a special point to describe anti-Semitism's what you call its foundational home as being on the political right. And you say that the right remains the most direct threat to Jews and all marginalized people. So I'm curious what that means, right? If anti-Semitism can be found across the political spectrum, why do you think its foundational home is on the right? And what is a foundational home for anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I mean, so if we think about what defines the right, one is a sense of a sort of rigid hierarchical identity, one that has, at least in the American context and to a degree in the European context, has been Christian, has been white, maybe ethnocentric on a more national level, but has historically built around exclusion of Jews, at least as the centerpiece of that diversity, right? So as we build up a right-wing political movement in the United States, it's going to be heavily built around Christian kind of hegemony, normalization, and its more extreme Christian nationalism. And at the same time, a racial politic that may exist a little bit on the fringes has moved a little bit more to the mainstream, but also has targeted Jews very, very specifically, particularly the last 100 or so years. And so when we look at like where an actual kind of dearth of very explicit anti-Semitism is coming from, it's overwhelmingly coming from the right. If we look at the numbers, the statistics itself, if you look at ideological motivation of anti-Semitic attacks, for example, it's overwhelmingly coming from the right. If you're looking at the centrality of ideology, so if you're looking at where anti-Semitism really motivates the action of political movements, it's overwhelmingly amongst white nationalists, the alt-right, neo-Nazis, and so on. And so it just sort of overwhelmingly sits in that one center. And what ends up happening is that if we talk about it as two extremes, we assume, like you said, that both of these sort of fringe political movements see Jews as outsiders and make them unsafe, except one has made it the foundational element on which they built their coalition. The other thing that's really important here is that as we head into increased sort of turmoil, political and social instability, economic instability, climate collapse, things like that, the right has to find a language to build up on populist energy. People are upset, people are losing their homes, their livelihoods, they are looking for answers. The left's answer for that has often been to critique capitalism, critique inequality itself. But if the right has sanctified inequality, if the right sees inequality as, kind of an acceptable element of a free society, then they have to mobilize populist energy a different way. And they've historically done that through conspiracy theories by pointing to George Soros or the Rothschilds or some exceptional group. And in the American and European context, conspiracy theories evolved explicitly from anti-Semitism. And this ends up actually maintaining anti-Semitic ideas through the generations of the right. So today, when we're looking at something like the National Conservative Movement, and they're talking about their vision of economic and social populism and nationalism, it's heavily centered on Christian nationalism, exclusion of non-Christian groups in the making of society, but also on a very conspiratorial way of understanding economic inequality, one that doesn't go after the systems of capitalism, but instead picks at particularly well-known names and picks up on anti-Semitic tropes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would really piggyback off that. There are numerous studies and statistics that have shown, for example, that the epicenter of anti-Semitic attitudes is among the young, Gen Z far right. There are many, studies that have shown this, and we don't have to look, far back in history to know that, fascist, authoritarian, and nationalist, movements, say, in the 20th century, haven't worked out so well for Jews, right? But for some reason, I think in this day and age, we forget this, and we tend to equate the loud noises that we might hear from a few campus protesters on the left with, say, the deadliest attack in American Jewish history at the Pittsburgh synagogue in 2018, and say anti-Semitism is an equal threat on the left and the right. And I think in our kishkas, most Jews ultimately know this is bogus. I think most Jews have consistently agreed that that multiracial democracy is what keeps us safe, that liberalism is what keeps us safe. It's why you've seen it consistent, like historically, high levels of American Jewish support for the Democratic Party, even if we do have some qualms about the left. And like Shane said, the rise of the MAGA movement, the rise of Trumpism has had these conspiracy theories at the center. And the white nationalist movement, which again is responsible for the deadliest attack on Jews in American history, has explicit anti-Semitism at its core. And next to the white nationalist movement, you have Christian nationalists who want to turn America into a nation for one religious group only, who want to basically turn Jews and other non-Christians into second-class citizens in all kinds of ways that we're going to talk about. So I think it's really, there's a lot of confusion out there right now. And the anti-Semitism that we do see on some parts of the left is real and needs to be addressed. But there's no denying that the way to find safety is with our neighbors and through trying to defend and preserve our multiracial democracy, rather than linking up with those forces who seek to dismantle it.
Great. And I mentioned this in the chat, seeing lots of good discussion, and feel free to talk amongst yourselves. But again, if you do want the panelists to have a chance to answer, please use the Q&A function. I see many people are. It's in the bottom toolbar. It says Q&A, and there's a little speech bubble with a question mark. And I saw someone raise their hand, but we can't do anything with that. So again, just put in the Q&A, please. So one of the interesting things, and I mean, you're obviously both coming from the left, but part of your analysis around conspiracy theory is that sort of conspiracy theory is animating and helpful for certain right-wing movements, like the idea of the Great Replacement theory, that Jews are trying to replace white people with non-white immigrants in the United States, that drives right-wing immigration policy. And that when we see it on the left, when we see conspiracy theory on the left, that it is actually damaging to the left-wing project. So when we see people blaming Jewish bankers or landlords for the housing crisis, that is obscuring the actual source of the problem. So it's a kind of boon to the right in certain respects and a detriment to the left. But one sort of funky phenomenon with that is that you sort of see anti-Semitism as animating right-wing movements that are targeted at non-Jewish groups. So they're targeted at, say, immigrants or LGBTQ people or Muslims or Black folks. And obviously, there are Jews who fall under some of those categories, but they aren't being targeted as Jews by the right. The neo-Nazis might like to target them, but by the time it trickles into actual conservative policymaking, the Jews aren't being targeted. And, I think we're seeing, and I saw a little bit of this chatter in the chat, that on the left, the like left-wing anti-Semitism or allegation of anti-Semitism that people are concerned about does talk about Jewish stuff a little bit more explicitly, often Israel. And so Jews and Zionists are coming up and sort of being named, whereas by the time it trickles down on the right, Jews aren't being named anymore. So I'm curious how much you see anti-Semitism on the right as a direct threat to Jews, and how much you see it as a threat to other marginalized groups. And so you're sort of saying to those groups and to the left more broadly, hey, if you care about anti-Black racism, you need to take anti-Semitism seriously because it's animating anti-Black racism. So how much is it like a
Yeah.
practical benefit to the left, and how much is it a threat to Jews?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's really a mischaracterization to say that the kind of explicit attacks on Jews on the right are only coming from the neo-Nazi fringe. I mean, since October 7th, you had Elon Musk, the richest man on the planet, say that Jews, and he was quite explicit in talking about Jews are engaged in quote dialectical hatred against whites. So this is a tweet that he co-signed and amplified and later doubled down on. Of course, right after that, Bibi Netanyahu invited him to tour the Gaza border and kind of gave him a kosher stamp of approval to say he's actually not an anti-Semite. Since then, you've seen Candace Owens, one of the leading figures in the MAGA movement with over 20 million followers, turn to explicit anti-Semitism, saying that basically Jewish cabals have engineered U.S. support for Israel. Just the other day, you had Donald Trump in a speech say that he used the words the Jewish lobby. He said the Israel lobby and the Jewish lobby is the most powerful lobby in the U.S. That statement, doesn't get the same headlines as when Elon Omar said it's all about the Benjamins a few years ago. And we can debate how much anti-Semitism was in that, but I think there's a big blind spot when it comes to seeing how much the mainstream establishment right doesn't just stop at George Soros or globalist conspiracy theories, and those are still anti-Semitic, but will explicitly name Jews and begin to really scapegoat our communities. So I think it's also worth noting that that when we point to how anti-Semitism fuels anti-Blackness, we aren't saying that one is subsidiary to the other. Like, we're saying that they're deeply connected, right? For example, last year or 2022, there was a mass shooting targeting a supermarket in a majority Black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York. That white nationalist shooter's manifesto was obviously deeply anti-Black. It was also deeply anti-Semitic. He blamed a cabal of Jews for orchestrating the Black freedom struggle, orchestrating mass immigration. And he said, we have to get to the Jews. Also we have to get to the Black community first. The Jewish community is next. So these ideologies of anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness on the right are deeply interconnected. These forms of oppression are deeply interconnected, and as we see a rise in anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant xenophobia, whether it's attacks on CRT, DEI, or vitriolic attacks on migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border, we're also seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, and that explicitly puts Jews in danger in this country.
Yeah,
and can I direct this? I want to sort of modify the question because I think you mentioned that you were working on something about, there's this question of saying that comes up in the book is that part of the reason you believe the left struggles to address anti-Semitism like it does other forms of racism and discrimination is that Jews don't necessarily appear to experience the same sort of systemic oppression that other groups do. So certainly there's anti-Jewish bullying that we see, especially where Jews aren't in the majority, there aren't many Jews in an area, in schools, in different communities in the U.S. And then we see extreme violence against Jews, street attacks and synagogue shootings, but we don't hear as much about things like not being able to get a mortgage because you're Jewish, or your neighbor, a Jewish neighborhood being disinvested in. So how much do you think Jews sort of actually experience systemic oppression? And what is your sort of message to other leftists who say, hey, Jews seem to be predominantly middle class, upper middle class white people. Why should I be fighting on their behalf?
Yeah, so I think it exists. There's a kind of a number of layers to the question here. I mean, I think the first is that we have to acknowledge that anti-Semitism just doesn't work like all other forms of oppression, but none do any of them, right? I think you can't just transfer experiences of one marginalized group to the other and hope that it looks exactly the same. So, like as you mentioned, anti-Semitism is often a conspiracy theory about power, and so it suggests that Jews are this kind of overarching rich cabal that's pulling the strings, and therefore anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are sort of a way of punching up at power. And so that can be an easy sort of populist answer to build up energy, sort of quote unquote, to attack the rich or the imperialists or whoever is sort of like the powerful caste in society. The question is, like, how does that actually manifest for Jews? And it manifests in a number of ways. So like you said, these incidents of pretty extreme violence. And when you look at a lot of the data, street attacks, incidents of harassment, incidents of individual bullying, things like that are actually quite frequent and reasonably severe. They often look different than anti-Black attacks or other kinds of anti-immigrant xenophobia or homophobic attacks, but we would expect them to, but the conditions are different. I think if we're talking about Jews that are incredibly visible, Orthodox, Haredi Jews, those numbers just go up more and more. And we also see what we might call systemic anti-Semitism in terms of housing and job discrimination. The treatment of Jews in prison, for example, is quite severe. With huge numbers of Jews reporting anti-Semitic violence at a systemic scale. There's a lot of these incidents that aren't particularly well tracked because they're not simply part of sort of the discourse we have, and also they don't really fit well into the reporting mechanisms we often see from large-scale anti-Semitism organizations. So they end up part of a different conversation. But they're also partially because we don't talk about oppression as this interlocking issue. So like Ben talked about, anti-Semitism in a way is not separate from anti-Blackness because they're part of the same sort of rhetorical and ideological scaffolding. And so the same forces that are often pushing systemic policies that target Black Americans also hold anti-Semitic views or Christian nationalist views that marginalize Jewish self-expression and things like that. So we should actually see those as more more connected and less separate, and then also look at issues of systemic oppression the same way. So if we have Christian nationalist policies that are, put into place in the U.S., that creates a systemic threat to Jews, right? Because it's creates a systemic threat to the diversity of religious expression, Jewish and otherwise. And so we can see that kind of commonality, but we have to see it as sort of one interlocking system. And like you sort of mentioned, the question then is it a threat to Jews, or does anti-Semitism create the rhetorical scaffolding that threatens other marginalized groups? And I think the answer is both, right? And that's actually why we talk about them together. Part of the issue with this sort of vertical alliance we talked about earlier is that anti-Semitism is separated from all other systems of oppression. We don't talk about structures. We don't talk about underlying causes. We only talk about individual manifestations. This thing happened on the street. It was really scary for folks. Someone said this, and it really was intimidating. But instead, we want to bring it back to that systemic conversation, because if we understand the same forces that are, for example, attacking trans healthcare right now or abortion rights are also pushing Christian nationalist policies or openly engaging in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, then we actually looking at a system of power, and we also look at what allies we have in creating a social movement that sort of fights it. So I want to basically bring those things back together and say it's actually one conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's important to name, because I'm seeing this in a little bit in the chat and some of the questions, which we'll answer some of them. I'll put them to you directly a little bit later. I just have a couple more questions, but people sort of saying, well, I thought this was about analyzing what the left can do about anti-Semitism. And I think, we're hearing a left-wing analysis of anti-Semitism, but I think part of the message in the book is that there are many people on the left who do not have the analysis that you're describing. So for liberal Jews, we hear, well, of course, white supremacy is a big threat to Jews along with all these other groups. But if you're not Jewish and you're on the left, you might not be thinking in those terms. You might be showing up and thinking that you're marching for other marginalized groups. It might not occur to you that these things are interwoven in the ways that you're describing. So that's why I wanted to start with that analysis, because even though I know that some of us have heard it before, I think it's what you're framing in the book to an audience that may include many folks who are not Jewish, not familiar with it. But I do want to talk about Israel, because I know that's where a lot of people's heads are at. So my understanding is you both conceived of, I think I saw the announcement for this book prior to last October. Is that Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Back in 2020. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously the ground has shifted a lot. I actually push back often against people who treat October 7th and the Israel-Hamas war and the fallout, including the anti-Semitism that we saw in the aftermath, as a total novel or completely new thing. I think it actually follows a lot of the trends that we've been seeing for years that I'm sure you both were familiar with. But it was an escalation, and we have now, we're into 10 months of headlines and disturbing incidents around the country. Ben, I know you were fairly vocal in the immediate aftermath of October 7th about some problematic things you heard at pro-Palestinian demonstrations, including support for the attack, if I'm not mistaken. And that comes through in the book in several places. And you make this sort of conditional argument that leftists and the sort of pro-Palestinian left need to have empathy for the historical Jewish attachment to Israel, and the reality that the majority of Jews are not going to pass an anti-Zionist litmus test. And I say it's sort of a conditional, and I'm going to read a little excerpt and feel free to correct as needed. But I say it's kind of a conditional statement because you write that it would be unrealistic, and here I'm reading, unrealistic, even problematic, to demand historical empathy and compassion from Palestinians as a precondition for peace and justice, especially absent even the slightest parallel gesture from their oppressors. But for most non-Palestinians, a refusal to seriously grapple with Jewish attachment to Zionism represents a colossal blind spot, undermining the left's aspirations to meet marginalized communities where they are at. If our approach isn't informed by a deep understanding of the underlying trauma and fear that has led so many Jews to put their faith in nationalism, we limit ourselves to a regrettably partial view of the picture, and our attempts to transform the hardened status quo won't be as effective or strategic. It's kind of a long excerpt, couple more sentences. We cannot dismiss broad swaths of any marginalized community as a priori enemies, unworthy of relationship and solidarity if they do not immediately agree to a radical critique that runs counter to their entire socialization. And there, I assume you're referring to anti-Zionism or the ideas associated therewith. To do so would be to abdicate our responsibility to transform that community, ceding territory to the right. Activists must meet people where they're at, treat them like they are worth more than just their political agreement, and work to move them along issues that matter. And it's a sort of analysis and an appeal to the left that I haven't seen come from folks who are really positioned within the left. Certainly people leave the left or leave liberal politics and say, I had to leave the left or I had to leave the Democratic Party because of Israel. But you're both folks who are still embedded within the left. And to continue my monologue a little bit longer, I'd like to press you a little bit on how realistic your appeal is, this idea that the left should be more open to working with folks who don't embrace or accept anti-Zionism, especially Jewish folks. You write elsewhere in the book about what Israeli scholar Shulamit Volkov calls cultural codes. And you write about her analysis of political conservatives who brand Democrats, and I'm extrapolating a little bit, brand Democrats as cultural Marxists or wokeists or even, groomers or pedophiles, something extreme, and who see Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton as like the devil incarnate. And these are views that are rooted in an actual political critique, but they also seem to have transcended that critique, right? They're not doing an analysis of Nancy Pelosi's like votes in Congress and determining that she's a Marxist. It becomes part of their identity, and they're over here, and those are the evil people over there. And I wanted to put to you that anti-Zionism may have become this sort of cultural code on the left that's transcended its grounded political critique into something more identitarian. I'm a good person because I'm fighting Zionism. Zionists are evil. And so to the extent that that is something that has taken place on the left, how do you speak to those people, and how do you convince those people that actually, even though you think Zionism is an evil genocidal ideology, you should still be willing to partner with this synagogue that has an Israeli flag on the bima, for example?
Yeah. It's a really big question, Arno. Thanks for raising it. Yeah, we talked, you and I, after October 7th, and I like many Jews on the left, was disturbed by some of what I saw from some corners of the left. I don't want to say, I don't want to paint a broad brush. I often feel like the media elevates the few voices who celebrated Hamas's October 7th attack uncritically as resistance, including the slaughter and kidnapping of Israeli civilians. Right, celebrating that. I was really disturbed by it, and we've seen that continue in some corners. Now, I think there's an interesting debate to be had on whether it's inherently anti-Semitism. I happen to think it is not inherently anti-Semitic. For example, after decolonization in France, in Algeria in the 1960s, parts of the left celebrated that as a violent process that included the massacre of some civilians among the French settler class, or certainly, characterize all French settlers as settlers, not distinguishing, between army and military and civilians. So whether it's inherently, driven by a fixation on Israelis as Jews, or whether it reflects a broader tendency on some parts of the left to adhere to like a strident and maximalist version of decolonial politics. It's not my politics. I think that that we need to maintain seeing the humanity of Israeli Jews as human beings and as Jews. I think we have to draw the line at attacks on civilians is wrong, right? No matter who's doing it, no matter whether it's a Palestinian resistance movement or whether it's the Israeli government. I think attacks on civilians are always wrong and inhuman. And we have seen some disturbing anti-Semitic signs at protests. We have seen since October 7th, people graffitiing Free Palestine on a synagogue simply because it's a synagogue, or harassing a random Jew on the street, yelling "Free Palestine." That happened in Brooklyn just last week, right? So this confusing of Zionism and Judaism and targeting Jews as Jews out of anger at what's happening in Israel is anti-Semitic and it's horrific. Full stop. So yeah, we have seen that, and I think yes, there is a potential on some parts of the left. I think to confuse, to overfixate on identity, and to overfixate on rooting out whether or not someone is a Zionist, or whether or not their Jewish classmate is a Zionist, or this Jewish institution in their community that might have a page about Israel on their website. And when you focus on identity in that way, you're missing out on the military industrial complex. Boeing is upholding U.S. support for what's going on in Israel a lot more so than a random pro-Israel institution that happens to be Jewish down the street, or Christian Zionists who are the largest pro-Israel community in the U.S., right, are upholding Zionism a lot more than most American Jews. So I think we have to look at these broader structures. I've said enough, though. Shane, what do you think?
Yeah,
And
no,
Shane,
I like this question a lot. I think,
Shane,
um,
can I just insert? I want to hear your answer as well. But for both of you, I'm curious. I understand intellectually the argument that you're making. How receptive do you think other folks on the left are to it? So you don't have to answer that first, but
yeah. Well, I was going to say, the term cultural code, the scholar also used to call anti-Zionism a cultural code in the left. So there was like a long precedent for actually highlighting it as a cultural code. So basically, where the term anti-Zionist ends up being like the term anti-capitalist, or something that feels like it needs to be said to have, moral entry into a progressive or left-wing political space. The problem sometimes is that we haven't actually defined what that term means, and its broadness actually conceals some people that don't have foundational sort of liberatory values, right? And so it creates that problem there of what we're even talking about when we use the term anti-Zionist. I think the question about whether or not the left is receptive is mixed. So I think, as we talk about in the book, the left has had an issue with dealing with anti-Semitism more than it has expressed anti-Semitic ideas, meaning it tends to not want to make movement on it, tends to not know very much, tends to not want to moderate or reassess tactics based on, someone highlighting that anti-Semitism has occurred, or that something feels wrong, or that the imagery has been used. That happens more frequently than you can really pin down anti-Semitic motivations on a particular campaign or a particular kind of political claim. But that is not true for the entire left, and it has not historically been true for the entire left. And we talk about a number of areas of the left that actually have taken this very, very seriously. So, for example, anti-fascist movements, which, starting about 2015, 2016, became a very, very large part of the social movement framework, actually take anti-Semitism incredibly seriously and do trainings on anti-Semitism, and have had many, many, many campaigns, public campaigns, that would target left-wing groups over perceived collaboration with anti-Semites or conspiracy theories or problematic associations in that way. So there are areas that have actually done that. And since the book has come out, it has mostly been left-wing groups, a lot of which involved in the movement for ceasefire or to end the genocide in Gaza, that actually want to talk about this and want to train their members and want to confront those sorts of things. So I think that's all very positive. There has been a lot of movement, I think, of this over the last decade, 10 to 15 years or so. I don't want to be Pollyanna about it. It's not always going to go well. And so I think that what we end up with is sort of two ways of dealing with these issues. Either you look at a social movement, a left-wing group, and you see anti-Semitism occur, and you decide we're going to deal with it. We'll do education, confront things, try and move stuff along in the same way that you would address any oppressive or bad behavior in a social movement. This is a conversation people have in these spaces all the time. It's really about making anti-Semitism a piece of that conversation, giving people the tools to work with it, and sort of making the case for why it's important. The other choice you have is to basically exclude some folks. And I think that there is definitely people on the fringes of left-wing social movements that people both have excluded and probably should. And I think that's also a conversation that happens in there. But part of it ends up happening when you are a part of the left, and when you're talking about this in a way where you've already established a relationship and shared values. So we interviewed one organizer in the book who had put together a training on anti-Semitism and invited all these different organizations to come and attend it. They wanted to get feedback, wanted to make it really good. And so at the end of the training, they asked for some feedback, and then all the organizations, many of which were major left-wing organizations, said some of the most anti-Semitic things you've ever heard. How do we talk about the real estate market when we know Jews control the real estate market in New York, things like that. And so they basically had a choice. We either kind of sever this relationship and start anew, or we try and confront this here. And so they tried to confront it there, and they basically built a long-term relationship with these groups, talking about this, coming back to them over time, moving them along, and they became really serious partners in campaigns against anti-Semitism. It will not happen every single time, but I think the reality is that we're talking about here is that either we are building social movements that can actually change the foundations that create anti-Semitism, or we're retreating from anyone that could be possible partners, and then we have no one to work with on this. And that's the status we are at right now with the Vertical Alliance. We have retreated from the social forces that actually can change society. Instead, we're trying to litigate it with speech bans, mask laws, definitions of anti-Semitism, and that's not working. If I'm looking at the status quo right now, both in the US and Israel, I'm not seeing much working in terms of defending Jews from anti-Semitism, and instead I'm seeing a lot of sort of restrictive social policies that are pushing kind of right-wing agendas that both make Jews and other marginalized groups less safe.
Great. Well, I think I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions, and we might go, folks want to stay on 5 or 10 minutes past to get more questions answered. I know some people probably have a hard stop at 8. One thing that I saw come up in a couple questions was this, a little bit of pushback on this idea that the right is the foundational home of anti-Semitism. And I know when I was reading the book, when you think back to the Soviet Union, for example, that went through these purges of Jews, I suppose one thing to say, you can say, right, that because anti-Semitism doesn't belong on the left, if the left does something deeply anti-Semitic, that's not actually the left. Those are, but what do you sort of say to folks who are raising those concerns, right? That, how do you explain the Soviet Union's anti-Semitism if its only home is on the right? And feel free to take a more expansive view of that. But I think
that's a good question. I mean, we definitely don't want to be Pollyanna, as Shane said. The left has its own traditions of anti-Semitism. The left also has its own traditions of anti-blackness. I mean, look at the labor movement in the U.S. in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there were a whole lot of white workers there who didn't want to ally with black workers. There's been misogyny on the left, right? And there's been any other kind of oppression you can think of that exists also on the left, because these are forms of oppression that are ingrained in our human society. They're part of the air we breathe. We all inherit anti-Semitism, just like we all inherit a racist ways of thinking or sexist ways of thinking, simply by living in a society that has anti-Semitism or racism or sexism in it. So, of course, these things are going to show up on the left. If you look at the Soviet Union, there were powerful, left-wing movements that overthrew Tsarist rule and tried to build a better world in the early 20th century. They were working in a context of hundreds of years of anti-Semitism, like derived from European Christianity, that was deeply ingrained across Russian society. So yes, it reappeared. There was a lot of laws against anti-Semitism, and they made a valiant effort to fight it. But it also reappeared in the course of history because it takes a long time to work to undo these kind of oppressive ideologies. But I think with any kind of oppression, I think you would say the same thing. Parts of the left can be anti-black or can be racist, but nobody would deny, I think, that racism is a much stronger organizing and structural principle on the white supremacist right. And I think essentially anti-Semitism is the same thing. Sure, it can be anywhere on the left, also on the center, basically anywhere in our society. But the right is the movement that's organizing that force, giving it the strongest expression, and putting it as a core a building block of authoritarianism. Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to be aware of what's called the No True Scotsman fallacy of saying, well, if it occurs on the left, then it's not truly the left because that violates the left's principles. I think there is a certain amount of looking at where a sort of radical movement basically strays from its actual goals and movements, and then it's really questionable at that point whether or not it's sort of living up to what it's claimed itself to be. And there's a very long history of that on the left. There's environmental movements that allied with anti-immigration groups like Ben talked about, the labor movement, particularly with like anti-immigrant xenophobia, even up to pretty recently, feminist movement and transphobia. There's a lot of these sort of situations in which the left will take on ideas that you'd think are foundationally a part of the far right and then take them in. When people are looking for a radical analysis and a radical changing of the world, oftentimes they'll take the radicalism that's available more than they will kind of look for the perfect kind of vessel and really think out those foundations. The left that has the anti-Semitism that has historically shown up on the left does often look different. So in the Soviet context, it's really about denying Jewish peoplehood, Jewish identity as a valid sort of a valid framework that people need to respect. And there hasn't really been a reckoning that that's happened. The Soviet Jewry movement didn't really sort of resonate with the left in the same way that other movements have talked about the historic anti-blackness of the labor movement, or there's been sort of like reconciliation and looking back and acknowledgement. And so I think that actually continues to linger in there, and the unwillingness and inability of them to reckon with the particularities of anti-Semitism. And again, part of this is because both it has not been discussed very much, it hasn't been a sense of importance. I think just the racial politics of the US make it so that anti-Semitism can be confusing and may not seem as important. And that's part of why we did this book, is to actually inject it back into the discourse and say, actually, there is a tradition of confronting this from the left. And there is a tradition of actually looking back into the left and saying where they failed to meet what they said they were objectively there to achieve. And so I think there's just a certain amount of actually looking back at radical politics in general and asking the question of, is this actually a liberatory movement? And that can span history. That can span all kinds of anti-capitalist labor movements, international anti-imperialist movements, and say, like, are you actually fighting for a better world, or are you just fighting sort of the enemy of today?
Great. I also see, and I know there was a question earlier about where people can get the book, which we're happy to answer. There'll be an email that goes out to everyone who attended, so we'll have a link in there. I don't know if I can pull it up in the next few minutes, but you can also Google Safety Through Solidarity and Ben and Shane's names, and it'll come up. So I want to kind of stitch together a couple questions that happen to align with my last question, which I wasn't going to ask, but now I will because I think it ties these together. So I'll just name the question so that you know what I'm sort of trying to touch on. One person asked, how to move Jews, and she referred to neoliberal Jews and helping people leave the cult of Zionism, which is obviously a question coming from a particular perspective. Another person asked, what do you say to those who believe that a Jewish ethno-state is the best way for Jews to be safe? I want to expand that question a little bit because you have this line in the book, and obviously this is sort of a radical leftist critique. And you write, ending capitalism won't end anti-Semitism on its own, but it's an indispensable step. And I would guess that there are a lot of people who are open to a lot of the ideas that you're sharing, but they may never, for ideological or pragmatic reasons, buy into abolishing capitalism or abolishing Israel, right? They might want a two-state solution with a Jewish nation, national project in perpetuity. So I guess is there space for those folks to work within the framework that you're proposing, or is this really a message just directed to people who are bought into or willing to buy into the more radical leftist movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you said, we're sort of unapologetically coming from the left, and this really is based on kind of like a long history of leftist analysis of how systems of oppression work. And we sort of, pin it back to capitalism because we're talking about what happens when communities are facing economic inequality and alienation. Where are they looking for answers and not finding any power? And that's often through anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and we trace a long history of that. And I think that does itself have a sort of revolutionary edge to it. That's why it's, a radical guide, right? Because we're trying to tear something out from the roots here. And so I think it does give that long-term vision. And, we come from a Torah tradition that talks about building a future world and what that looks like and what it looks like to heal the world. So I feel really committed to that project of it's not actually just about these solutions today, right? Like we're thinking about this in a real long term. But any good revolutionary project thinks about today, the hour right now first, and what are those actual solutions? And I think the answer is that we are not seeing them particularly well right now. When I look at Israel, I do not think to myself, what a tremendously safe bunch of Jews. I don't think that the situation we have right now is tenable, or that it's keeping Jews safe, or that it's protecting us against anti-Semitism either globally in the US or in Israel. So I think we actually have to start looking at some different solutions. And I think like acknowledging the reality that this has failed over the last 30, 40, 50 years, that gives us the opportunity to try something new. And I think we will actually see the benefit almost immediately when you are organizing in your communities, when you're organizing with other folks facing kind of similar sources of oppression. You see those gains almost immediately because you can look at other social movements and see how they've done that. Communities where people have strong alliances, where you know your neighbors, where you're a part of a kind of collective social movement, are able to change society rather rapidly. And so I think people should think about what it takes to confront anti-Semitism in their community right now. And what does it mean to know their neighbors, to create safety plans, to address those things, to train folks on these issues? That's actually a more practical and a much more rapid solution than hopefully passing IHRA protection laws or changing policy about masks. That gives us a much more practical way forward next week, the week after, the year after that. And so I think in a way, while we are talking about the distant future, and I think it's important to keep that horizon, what is possible, a different world actually is possible, but it all is made up of small steps to get there. And so I'd like to invite people in to say, like, if people are concerned or people don't immediately show radical politics, that's something we talk about in the book. That's not actually what we're asking of folks. What we're asking for them is to have a faith in other folks, that talking to them, that building social movements, that looking at systems of power might actually deliver on what they're looking for. And it's one of those situations where people can actually try this process and see if it starts changing the circumstances. Because I think we have to acknowledge that even the fact that we're having this conversation right now notes that something has not been working and it is time to try something else.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, like, all of our politics have evolved and are continuing to evolve. And I wouldn't be where I am today if I wasn't continually open, to the perspectives of a wide variety of thinkers, including those who I didn't agree with fully when I started reading or listening, and many of whom I still didn't agree with fully when I was done. Right. So I'll be honest. Our book is probably not going to have that much of an appeal for people who are firmly ensconced in a MAGA worldview, right? Like we did one event where there was someone from the audience who was saying, oh, but isn't George Soros an enemy of the Jewish people? And doesn't he actually fund all these progressive movements from behind the scenes? We were like, okay, this person is probably not going to agree with us. They get a lot of their thinking from Fox News. Okay. But for the rest of us, for the broad majority of American Jews and Americans who believe in multiracial democracy, who believe in fighting the advance of MAGA and of authoritarian movements, I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And maybe you don't agree with ending capitalism, but you think there's too much wealth, inequality in this country. I think this book is still for you, and you can learn a lot. And you might not agree with everything, but that's okay. I think now more than ever, we needed to all be listening to each other. That includes me also listening to folks who I don't fully agree with. Those of us who are in like a broad a pro-democracy coalition, whether we're more quote unquote liberal or more quote unquote leftist, we need each other right now. And so I would hope this book has something for everyone.
Great. Well, thank you. There are so many wonderful questions that I don't think pushing 5 minutes is going to really help us answer. And that was, I think, a succinct summation, Ben. So I'm inclined to leave it there, which also puts us perfectly on time. I will say, I think Ben put a link in. I also put a link into bookshop.org, which is an independent platform, and the forward gets a commission. So if you are interested in purchasing it, certainly we're happy for you to use that link. We will send a recording of this event to everyone who attended or registered. So if you know somebody who couldn't make it, you can forward them the link, or if you just want to watch it back to soak it all in more, feel free. You can reach me by email at arno@forward.com. That will also be in the follow-up. And I will say I tried to prioritize questions that I don't think were necessarily addressed in the book. So some of the questions like, can you provide some examples of anti-Semitism on the left? Those are in the book, as are some examples, which we didn't touch on much about where you see the sort of approach you're looking for in action. So that's another thing that folks can find there. But again, thanks everyone for great discussion in the chat. Thank you so much, Ben and Shane. And thanks to our behind the scenes forward staff for making this event run smoothly, and have a good rest of your Tuesday night.
Thanks for having us, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.